So I'm Jenny Cookson. Welcome to Manifold's Experimental Criticism Symposium, and specifically to our panel on critical manifestos. Along with Emma Gomes, who is right there on your screen as well. I'm the co-editor of Manifold and the co-curator of this symposium. And we are connecting, both of us, from Colorado, and we'd like to acknowledge that Manifold was founded and is based on land within the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. So just a quick reminder, again, keep yourselves muted for the duration of the presentations, but you certainly can chat away in the chat function there and put questions in there if you have them, and we'll try to circle back to them in the Q&A section, which is at the end of the presentations. Let's see. I think that's all the logistics. Yeah, okay. Use the chat. It's really fun to kind of see how people are reacting in real time. So we're excited to celebrate the launch of our inaugural issue of Manifold. It's really beautiful, the physical object itself, and it's available on our website. We also have a digital edition of it. It's supposed to be shipping actually today, which is very exciting. It's perhaps in boxes on its way to us right now. So hopefully we'll be able to get it out to you pretty soon after that, depending on where you are in the world. Today, as I said, the theme of this panel is critical manifestos, and manifesto from the Latin manifestare, reveals and makes palpable, makes public that which is urgent. So when Emma and I started working together on this project, our first urgent public act was the drafting of our own manifesto. And we structured our manifesto as a kind of textual splicing between the metaphorical and the imperative modes. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to share a bit of that with you. It's also on our website if I read too fast or you want to revisit. But okay, so here is our manifesto. We think that the existing models for academic and critical publishing privilege and perpetuate existing hegemonies, and that critical form needs sustained intervention and experiment. The earth was flat, said cartographers and kings, and it looked Euclidean, no matter the coordinates. But as imperialism sent ships out to follow lines of capital until they ended, people eventually ended up where they'd begun, giving the lie to the flat plane theory of progress. Even modern maps are just two-dimensional manifolds imprisoned by the hegemony of unilateral motion. What would happen if the avant-garde occupied the critical essay, if the essay was broken apart and room was made, recesses opened up? Critique could happen into pockets of space, move through alternate rooms, make room for moments where time is suspended. Given space to meander, it could find unpredictable paths or routes, create new forms of critical thought. These experiments enact and instrumentalize our work as a way to disrupt traditional academic discourse, not by rejecting the critical, but by subverting it. At large scales, the earth folds up on itself. It only looked flat because the perspective was limited to the singular human eye. On a map, each quadrilateral might be compared to the reach of that single gaze. By just standing in any one spot on the grid, it is impossible to know what shape manifold earth takes. Is it flat or a sphere or a torus, a bottle, a blossom? It is a manifold of unrevealed proportion until each piece of the grid is disabused of its flattening impression of objectivity. A true innovation or experiment and intervention in criticism puts the form of the critique in direct conversation with the work that it addresses. Thus, Manifold publishes works of criticism that experiment with form and perspective, that find room and leave space while still remaining first critiques. So that's our manifesto, and this is our mission: the reformation of academic critical discourse, the disruption of the hegemony of what counts as criticism. And thankfully, we are not alone in that mission. Indeed, the co-host of this panel, BC Editions, rose from the foam of academic criticism with its own manifesto, and Simon Palfrey, one of the founding editors of the series, is here to speak to that manifesto and to the erosion of any sharp distinction between the creative and the critical, to the fluidity of the borders marked out by each. In addition to his groundbreaking editorial work at BC Editions, Simon is professor of English at Brasenose College, Oxford University. His recent work explores the unique kinds of life generated by dramatic, poetic, and fictional forms, and the opportunities this opens up for more imaginative, philosophically adventurous, and politically engaged critical work. His books include Doing Shakespeare, Arden 2004, a TLS International Book of the Year, Shakespeare in Parts, Oxford 2007 with Tiffany Stern, the MRDS Book of the Year, Poor Tom, Living King Lear, Chicago 2014, Shakespeare's Possible Worlds, Cambridge 2014, and the forthcoming Macbeth, Boiler House 2021, a critical fiction written with Ewan Fernie. Simon's current project is the twice AHRC award-winning Demon's Land, a poem come true, a mixed media event, film, drama, dance, paintings, sculptures, soundscapes, text that imagines an island built in the image of Spenser's epic poem, The Fairy Queen. Simon is writer and director of the project, and whose latest iteration is a collaboration with Indigenous Australian artists and practitioners exploring different understandings of home, land, and country. See demonsland.com. So welcome, Simon, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jenny. It's great, and I don't just say any more really. What I thought I'd do is rather than directly read the manifesto on something, as give a brief sense of that, what we did in the manifesto, and then talk about a couple of things that I'm doing. One with my teaching at Oxford, and then just giving a little bit of information, a bit of a sense of the kind of the backstory, the sort of the imaginative or even sort of emotional backstory to a couple of the projects that Jenny just mentioned. So, firstly, BC Editions. It's very in all sorts of ways. It's similar to what we've heard about Manifold. It seeks to discover new forms for new thinking about literature. We want to break down false divisions between scholarship and imagination, between accountability and adventure. And to think critically is to think creatively. To think creatively is to think critically. I think that's just true. We also want to reach out to readers beyond the cloister. We think there's a hunger among wider reading publics for ideas and argument and experiment, for fearless thinking and theorizing that doesn't simplify or condescend. The division between academic and non-academic humanities and individuals is a fiction. I mean, the idea that you stop being interested in these things just because you've left your course or not tenured or something is just nonsense. Crucial here is the written form that our thinking takes. We're not, in the series, we're not interested in pouring thoughts into standard templates. We want to liberate critical thinking and writing from obedience to dominant models, what Jenny was just saying. Depending on the work, this might be the level of the sentence, syntax, argument, vocabulary, mood, mode, technology, medium, whatever. We ask that our writers discover the form that best embodies their ideas and that best communicates the life in reading, and which also, of course, means the life in the works they are reading. We think that, I mean, one thing we stress in a manifesto is this has been going on forever, since Homer or whatever, all through the history of literature and thinking and philosophy and so forth. There's been creative modes of writing, but there's something about the specialization, the professionalization of literary studies and so forth, which leads to a bit of an ossification, and we want to break out of that. Now, part of that is at Oxford, which of course is the oldest university in the English-speaking world. And I've got this course there called Possibilities of Criticism, which is the first course in the history of the university that imports creative writing and formal improvisation into assessed student work. There's a brief sense of that course. So it explores alternatives to traditional scholarly argumentation and propositional thinking. It asks why more imaginative, formally innovative methods might be necessary, transformative, or even true. We consider the challenges this presents to our critical structures and languages, its potential opportunities, and also its potential pitfalls, which I think is important. Each week, we concentrate upon a different kind of formal adventure, variously theoretical, confessional, fictive, ironical, dialogical, polemical, fabular, poetic, aphoristic, probational, experimental, they're all experimental, and ventriloquial. We ask why they're written in this way and what, if anything, is newly revealed or engendered. Now, the course hopes to encourage in the students, and in me, obviously, a searching approach to literature and to criticism, true to the original meaning of the word essay from Montaigne, of course, meaning to test or try or taste in a form that's definitively unfinished. This may issue in work that's more frankly exposed or politically invested than is conventional in ostensibly dispassionate academic work. The approach might be oblique or fragmented or consciously partial. The student's chosen technique is crucial, meaning the tools adapted and the skills practiced for the task. So too their voice, questions of structure, citation, silence, imitation, and so forth. And this, and it's important that the text should not be seen as a static object to be analyzed. It's a nest of relationships revealed or remade by perhaps unexpected attention. We ask what it might be to read, how to be faithful to such experience, however errant, what kinds of recognition and identification does reading involve, and what might it mean truly to perform the possibilities of reading or of a reading. And it's proved an extremely popular, it's always oversubscribed course. It's going really very well. Now, a couple of examples. Jenny mentioned the Macbeth, which is a novel which is forthcoming from Boiler House in a month or two. This is a collaborative fiction I've written with my friend Ewan Fernie. It was sort of not just written with him, but sort of imagined, dreamt by the two of us together. And that it's at once a sequel and a critique and a repetition of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Now, writing together itself was fundamental here. I've done various collaborations, but this one was sort of unique. It was in itself a sort of liberating experience. It allowed more adventurous thought, free from any jealous ownership. Any idea, any inkling of an idea, however furtive, could be embodied or storified. Now, throughout the project, we tried to stay faithful to the play world's most intimate physics and emotions, both those things. We used to talk about wearing the play like a harness on our backs, which some of you will know was a reference to a moment in Macbeth. Now, a couple of simple premises that the play's swiftly moving scenes invite us to infer more, to imagine more. And likewise, Shakespeare's notoriously dense metaphors teem with possibilities. We wanted to almost literally, physically enter these words, bring them to new life, just as we entered other gaps in the play. Another way of putting it is to say that we wanted to find out the buried lives. Now, Macbeth, of course, is full of them. And yet there are delicate mysteries amid the violence, and nothing and no one is safely dead. So it was a form of necromancy or something, the whole act of writing. Now, to enter the world of Macbeth, wherever we locate that world, and I think it's important, I think one of the things that really needs a jolt is conventional notions of historicism. Anyway, whether we locate it in the 11th century, in 1606 when it was written, or in a sort of ever imminent present, it's to confront the violence of sexual relations and gender nominations, and more broadly, the coerciveness of institutions and words. Such things, so the play here, the point, of course, is that the play sort of embodies, enacts everything we're talking about in this symposium. Such things have a shaping, persisting reality for everyone, man, woman, girl, boy. And to pretend to escape them is just sentimental evasion, wishfulness. But you can't just collapse into obedient iteration. You have to both seek inside convention and search beyond convention. And that is what we've tried to do in Macbeth. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the Demon's Land project, which, as Jenny said, is a multi-pronged project involving film and play and paintings and so forth, which is collaborative with a few of my friends, and it's been going for a few years now. And as she said, I'm working with Tasmania, sort of North Queensland Indigenous practitioners and artists at the moment. That's very exciting, although it's been frustrated by the virus, and I can't actually get there at the moment. But anyway, I'm also writing the book of the project, and its working title is A Poem Come True, which interweaves intense readings of Spenser's Faerie Queene, which of course is some of you will know, is a deeply guilty atavistic, seductive, ravishing poem, hallucinogenic poem, an amazing poem, which is the premise of the project is that this poem has kind of been the sort of seminal text of global history ever since, and it's been repeating differentially throughout history, but also in large scale world historical modes, but also in sort of the minor key of individual lives, including my own. And that's partly what I'm writing about. And so I interweave, as I say, readings of the poem with an archaeology of the project, including sort of epiphanies of my own adolescence in Tasmania, where I grew up. And Tasmania, of course, has its own very, very dark history, and other evocations of Australia's history. All different ways in which these were ways in my life or in history or in criticism itself in which the poem can come true or be made to come true. I see it as a different kind of life writing, a different kind of historical writing, understanding both as passion in the fullest sense of the word, as sort of unfree, but also sort of vehement, grounded in the imaginative possession, for better and worse, of what we read, because I think it's important that we shouldn't sort of, again, idealize or sentimentalize reading. It need not be an innocent process or procedure. Now, I just wanted to finish with a sort of statement, a kind of riff really about what I was hoping to do, what made me sort of return to a different mode of literary criticism, if you like. And I fancied initially composing something simple and true, something strategically naive. I was, I suppose, on a kind of quest, my own quest for the purpose of poetry, a quest to discover what it might mean or what it might be for a poem to model a world, for a poem to model a life or model history, for a poem truly to come true. Also a quest to find out whether a career such as mine, which was kind of accidentally crystallizing as it seemed to be crystallizing, was in any sense meaningful or true. Whether reading and thinking and writing about literature can still matter. A quest to find in the work I do and the work I read some access to our sort of boiling viral world. A quest to connect my past as a sort of marginal Tasmanian with my present as a paid up Oxford professor, teaching young people as though I know the first thing about anything. A quest to touch worlds or peoples I'd only read about, recover the undead past as the key to the future. It was also a quest to escape the bounded crib of possession and expose it all really to risk and doubt and challenge and danger. Anyway, so I started writing a few years ago now with these sort of stirring imperatives in my mind. And within minutes, the thought became impossible, sort of existentially fraudulent. I didn't have a clue how to go about it. The conventions of academic address began to sort of unpeel before my eyes, like, exposed cabling in a ruin or something, or like some insupportable ideology. It seemed false to the poetry, false to my imagined audience, false even to the act of reading and to the attention it has to summon. No doubt the thought of skeptical young auditors I wanted to write to young people, as it were, has a peculiar power to embarrass. No doubt it doesn't vitiate all such writing, but it vitiates something, demands something to be rethought. There are few things worse than to be caught in a lie. There are responsibilities to life and truth, or the wish at least to seek and to speak either. So how could I say that this matters unless it does? And if it didn't matter, then I'd wasted a large portion of my life. I didn't feel I'd wasted it, but how to know? And so the initial things, just the initial things which made me actually turn to this poem, which I'd never really got. And my motives were slightly maverick, I think, founded in ignorance as much as restless excitement. But so first, I'd still never got the poem, never quite understood it, never felt it in my bones, but I respected its excessiveness, its obstinacy, its manifest inordinacy, even its faintly absurd irrelevance. I thought, here's kind of a beast worth feeding. Second, I resisted almost physically the little I'd read about the poem. However erudite or authoritative, this criticism seemed like a parallel network to which I would never gain entrance. I thought it abstracted the poetry's strange allure and barely touched those things that enticed and sort of defied my understanding. Third, I wasn't satisfied by the poem's immediate contexts, at least insofar as these contexts have been identified by critics, other than as a sort of provocation to travel elsewhere. Now here I again appeal kind of imaginatively to the poem's massiveness and weirdness and variousness. Surely so singular a thing couldn't have such a settled relation to its surroundings. It couldn't be so passive a recipient. It couldn't be so past, responding datively to other things that were past. Fourth, I wondered if too much honor was paid by critics to frame texts, to proems and paratexts and apologies, all of those secondary revisions, instead of to the dark matter of the verse. Fifth, I read somewhere that this poem, defies the procedures of attentive reading. It wasn't made that way. It was too macro or mole in its organization, too spacious and slow moving. And I simply didn't believe this. Maybe the answer was the opposite. Maybe the answer was the opposite. Not to take the distance view, but to magnify, not to breeze over details in the accumulation of homologies, but to move ever slower in the poem's room-like cells and recursive spaces. I was sort of imagining like my antenna like some insect or something, just taking, like that. Sixth, I conjectured that scholarship has been too enamored of its own priorities and epistemologies, its own ledgers of significance, and has found them as though by answering necessity, but without really acknowledging the fact, sort of obediently anticipated in its objects of attention. So the work begins to, as it were, mirror the scholarly priorities. What about reversing this process, I thought? Acknowledge that the poem, for whatever reason, must always elicit and exceed any self-fulfilling frames. Seventh, and as a counterweight to self-fulfilling bias, I wanted to try to model critical systems of knowing on the poems. What about seeing the poem not as an object, not even as a subject, but as an ecological system, teeming and febrile and combustible, not so much purposive as just here. And finally, I knew no other work of literature that, for all of its teeming details, was in its effect so sort of suspended and sort of mediate or something. I mean, there was almost no point in the poem where I thought, as I so often do with writing that I really love, I thought, yeah, that's it, you've got it. I know that. I didn't, with this poem, I almost never feel that. Still don't, never feel that. It always feels removed or foreclosed, experience kind of translated into toy soldiers or toy landscapes that then asked to be translated back into knowledge. And yet, and here's the thing which still gets me, is still it exacts this sort of fascination. It keeps seeming to know, even as it didn't grant great moments of recognition. The poem seemed to brood upon a wisdom based, I began to think, not in some epiphenomenal self-evacuating, other signifying play in kind of allegory, but almost the opposite, in a terrifying realism and local accountability, a remorseless formal integrity in which the form tells true, even where the poet or his task wouldn't. And in all of that, it seemed to me that I was trying to live up to the idea of what would it mean to make not just the poem come true, but the act of writing true to whatever makes us do what we do, this kind of wild, mad, strange, pointless thing we all do. Anyway, so the idea there is just, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that. And so that's an example of what I'm trying to do, and kind of those kind of principles sort of leaking through a lot of my work. Anyway, thank you.
Yes, if we can all unmute. Virtual. Thank you, Simon. Very taking notes. You know, a spider web of notes and connectivities. Very excited to ask you questions later.
Me too. So many notes.
Okay. So our next presenter is Andrea Quaid. And in considering the manifesto as a critical form, we asked our panelists to ruminate on a set of questions. How can a critical text enact a reformation or reformation? What can poetics offer the critical architecture? How can we reimagine our pedagogical responsibilities in a way that offers a fluid and adaptable space from which generative critical thinking can emerge? And our next panelist, Andrea Quaid, I think is particularly poignant on that last question, her essay in Manifold Approaches, Sedgwick's concept of holding relations as a portal into a pedagogical practice of reciprocity. So, and Andrea's work focuses on poetry and poetics, pedagogy, and feminist studies generally as well. She's a co-editor of Acts and Encounters, a collection of works about experimental writing and community, and Urgent Possibilities, writing on feminist poetics and emergent pedagogies, both published on Eohippus Labs. With Harold Abramowitz, she curates RAD residencies at the Poetic Research Bureau. She teaches in the Bard College Language and Thinking program and in the Critical Studies department at Cal Institute for the Arts. She directs Humanities in the City, public programs focused on education, equity, and the transformational power of interdisciplinary humanities study in classrooms and communities. And in this time of physical and emotional alienation, we are very grateful to Andrea for giving us a pedagogical manifesto that meets the urgency of this moment. So, Andrea.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, I'm coming from Los Angeles today, the unceded territories of Pongva, Chumash, and Kizh peoples. And I'm happy to be here. Jenny and Emma, thank you so much for your Manifold project. I love the multidimensional part of it, from a print book to an experimental symposium, joining it and just expanding the community as you built the panels out. It's really, really lovely. Thank you to BC Editions also for co-hosting, and so happy to be here with Ronaldo and Christina and Simon. And friends, it's nice to see different names in the room. So nice to be here. Make sure my volume is all the way up. Okay. So maybe by way of introducing my piece, I'll say a few things and then read a couple of excerpts from the piece that Jenny was introducing. I was listening to the introductions about sustained intervention. That's what stood out to me, and about what counts as criticism, and these questions about the divide or not divide between critical and creative work. And so perhaps when thinking about my own projects or my own process, or how I think about the work with the manifesto, maybe it might be for me less about an against a tradition of more traditional literary criticism, how we might think about that. But I do love the invitation of the aspirational part of the manifesto, or the critical manifesto, of bringing into being something in our present future, into our now. But with that said, I'm writing alongside many people who've been doing this for a really long time. So feminists, poets, critical theorists who constantly challenge that divide, the division between political and personal, between creative, critical. And we can talk about maybe in the Q&A, different people that influence my work, or who I think with. I like to think about as thinking with, who have influenced it from an earlier time, and then who are doing work right now that continues to be who I think of myself as in conversation with. With experimental criticism, for me, it's very much about thinking of bringing poetry and critical work into closer relationship. So what that means is something about bringing in compositional decisions that poets use, and that we can work and bring into maybe what would be a piece of criticism. So gaps, leaps, associative leaps in idea that might move away from more linear modes of writing or logic, making meaning through associative connections between ideas, but also sound and that attention to how language is working on a page, how it looks on the page. And so this piece that I'm going to read from, Holding Relations, is thinking these two things together of poetry and poetics. That's what this, or sorry, poetics and pedagogy, my P's, I've got all my P's here, my poetics and pedagogy, with close readings that emphasize the pedagogical in these other texts. So it won't be the full array, but there'll be selection there in the piece. There's selections of poetry, essay, educational text, personal experience. And so the piece is very much about, and that's the aspirational part that I'm hearing in Manifesto, about visioning how we can transform this learning, teaching mode into a very reciprocal relationship that moves against traditional hierarchies. And in that work, I'm looking to others who are thinking along those lines. So, holding relations. I find myself in poetry while writing about theory. I find myself in poetics while writing about teaching. I find myself in pedagogy while thinking poetics. I find a poem when searching for critique. I find imagination when searching for a claim. I find myself without an answer. I ask another question. Thesis, a poetics and pedagogy of holding relations. I return again and again to a passage from Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's A Dialogue on Love. The text compiles poetic stanzas, journal entries, narrative accounts, and her therapist's notes. Reflecting on an encounter with her therapist, she writes, quote, I have trouble formulating this. The next few sentences are haltingly assembled. You know, when I start telling you something by saying, I was thinking about what you said about, it gives me pleasure to say that, to let you know I was brooding on your words. And I think the pleasure is, well, I know how much I love it when you say, I was thinking about what you said about, unquote. Key to Sedgwick's formulation is the pleasure of sharing again. I was thinking about what you said about, an invocation of the initial exchange and its transformations through body and time and consideration to offer and receive, an affirmation, a practice of being present with one another. What sparks for me is Sedgwick's concept of holding relations. She continues, quote, it's somehow as though the part of you that's in me will be able to nourish the part of me that's in you, or something. I don't know how to put it, but that there's some circuit of reciprocity between these holding relations, your ability to hold me inside you and mine to hold you inside me, unquote. I return to Sedgwick's holding relations as a pedagogical practice. She describes a way to think about knowledge sharing in the classroom as one that insists on our relationality and responsibility to one another. Holding as transformation. Together, we slow our everyday momentums into different attentions. Together, we favor collective analyses over individual mastery of subject matter, experience how process is as critical as the end result, and reflect on how we learn alongside what we learn to ask new questions about how we work together inside and outside of the classroom. Holding relations and their circuit of reciprocity recall me to feminist consciousness raising circles that challenge a personal political split, to Paulo Freire's conscientiation circles and literacies that insist on the dialectical relationship between word and world, to Bell Hook's call to educate as the practice of freedom and her invocation of sacredness, spiritual growth, and souls, and what this might mean for in our very secular classrooms. To Joan Retallack's geometries of attention, asking us to challenge our habits of perception and, quote, attend to the many silences, aesthetic, historical, social, that affect everything we do, unquote. And to Trinh T. Minh Ha's interval as a questioning practice that renders us most fully alive in the space between not knowing and knowing. So I'm going to move ahead to one other excerpt from the piece. Renee Gladman's Calamities is a book of essaying prose pieces that all start with the phrase, I began the day. The collection, expansive in its different settings and lines of inquiry, includes scenes of academia. Here is the classroom, the lecture, the faculty meeting, and the university visit. I began begins each time with the phrase's activating energy, carrying a promise of newness and that something, the day, a moment, an encounter is opening. Quote, I began the day giving a lecture to a group of university students, unquote. The repeated phrase and its creative energy form entry to sentences that unfold by turns. In this way, a single sentence can move a reader through elaboration, contradiction, impasse, an invitation. And the next three quotes are from Gladman's essays. I began the day in a faculty meeting, though I was late in coming, having just walked into the room. I began the day with the profound realization that the person in the world was not a philosophical placeholder, as I had been treating it for the last 20 years, but was actually a student in my class of 11 silent girls. I began the day thinking about the university level, where it was and who was allowed to go there, and felt in my body a sense that there were a series of gates to pass through, a grand lawn, a series of gates, and then an elevator to take you down into the earth. Sentences pause by em dash, by comma, by conjunction, by sequences of phrases, by a narrator, Gladman's person in the world, alive in sentences and scenes. Quote, let's start again, unquote, the narrator in one of the essays, a teacher gestures to students when her attempted lecture is met with revolt. Let's start again. Gladman's sentences build into prose shaped both by a forward narrative trajectory and by a sense of suspension. It is the suspension I'm interested in here, a suspension that holds. The narrator seeks to impart a reading strategy to her students. Quote, I began the day looking up at the whiteboard, wondering how I would do the thing I needed to do. My students were waiting, unquote. It is minutes before class ends, and she realizes they need an entry point into Ed Roberson's poetry. The narrator asks, how could I send them off to read Roberson's book without having explained poetry to them? The moment is when one still tries to instruct at the very end of class. She might stand, raise her voice, reach a hand forward as if to halt the inevitable, already in motion students leaning toward the door and into their next class and the rest of their day. The moment lives as hope and futility, a single desire moving against a room of other desires. I wanted to say, states the narrator in a moment further complicated by the simultaneous revision of her own ideas. Quote, I wanted to say, often when reading poetry, it's the grid you're experiencing, unquote. Gladman's sentences suspend and hold the scene into a heuristic, how to read poetry, how to teach others to read poetry. When encountering the poem, the narrator suggests a reader is experiencing a grid of light, angular, multidimensional, at once opaque and illuminating. Lines of a grid as a poem and lines of a poetic text, both are emanations charged and refracting through language and feeling. The heuristic builds into perhaps. Perhaps to read poetry is to read through a sieve. Class is already ended. The narrator offers, quote, poetry comes out of nothing, opening something I would never be able to close, unquote. She shouts, quote, read the nothing as they walked out the door. As the essay closes, the narrator's interpretive schema continues to unfold in the tenuous holding relation between teacher and students. I think I'll close there. Thanks.
If you could all unmute yourselves and clap for Andrea.
Very sweet, thank you.
I so respect your thinking and also just your attention, speaking of geometries of attention to community, and everything you do to foster that is really wonderful. So thank you for your piece and your reading and your community building.
Thank you.
Christina Rivera Garza was meant to be our next reader, but she has had a confusion with the time zones. So we're hoping that she will be able to join us towards the end. But for now, we're going to move on to Ronaldo. Ronaldo Wilson is the author of Narrative of the Life of the Brown Boy and the White Man from University of Pittsburgh, winner of the 2007 Cave Canon Prize, Poems of the Black Object Future Poem Books, winner of the Tom Gunn Award for Gay Poetry and the Asian American Literary Award in Poetry in 2010. His latest books are Father Traveler, Poetry, Prose, and Others from Counterpath, which was finalist for a Tom Gunn Award for Gay Poetry, and Lucy 72. Co-founder of the Black Took Collective, Wilson is also a mixed media artist, dancer, and performer. He has performed in multiple venues, including the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, UC Riverside's Arts Block, Georgetown's Lannan Center, Dixon Place, the Atlantic Center for the Arts, among others. The recipient of the fellowships from Cave Canem, the RC Residence Artist Program, the Ford Foundation, Kundiman, McDowell, the National Research Council, the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, the Center for Art and Thought, and Yaddo. Wilson is a professor of creative writing and literature at UC Santa Cruz, serving on the core faculty of the Creative Critical PhD program and co-directing the creative writing program. Ronaldo has 4 short pieces in Manifold, which are from his forthcoming book, The Conservation of Mass, which is will be out on Nightboat. And we decided to weave these 4 pieces throughout the issue. As such, they serve as both grounding recurrences and points of departure into an imaginative realm that takes a highly creative approach to critical thinking. This simultaneous grounding and departure feels akin to the movement within his text. With a fluid and fluctuating performative eye, the narratives move somewhere between dream and hyper-grounded reality, while posing questions like, how much does one need to let go of to enact freedom? I've always admired Ronaldo's work for the way it takes on a very rigorous, serious, critical engagement, while always remaining highly playful and creative. It's constantly bending genre and rupturing boundaries between mediums. And I'm so thrilled that he's here with us today. So, Ronaldo.
Thank you, Emma. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. It was such a treat to be here. And I'll just say a few things. Thanks, Simon, for your opening salvo and for moving us into the space of sequel, repetition, and critique, particularly around, well, I love what you said about this notion of epiphanies of adolescence, which I think I'm always mining. And Andrea, I was so taken by your work. Just blown away and proud. Andrea is one of our PhD, well, our doctorates, our doctors, our ER doctors, graduate of UC Santa Cruz in literature. And I'm really so moved that you brought up Eve's work, who was a teacher of mine, and Renee's work was also, so I'm a little bit, kind of unmoored by that lineage that you evoked, that I think, and then to bring it all back, I'm so thankful to be in conversation with Emma and Jenny, who were so, brilliant around bringing this collection together. And thanks also for BC Press for co-sponsoring this. I wanted to, and also Christina, I hope Christina makes it, and I hope so. I wanted to do a couple of things. I wanted to, I guess talk about Eve Sedgwick all day. I will say that I wanted to crack an egg and eat it live here because I'm sort of hungry, but then I thought that would be distracting. So imagine that I'm cracking an egg with you now, and I can't eat and read at the same time. There's so many things that I want to do here, but I do want to think about this idea of moving into the texts that I want to share with you today in a couple of ways. I guess I'm supposed to be thinking around pedagogy and generative ways of thinking through critical thought. So I'm just imagining my egg right now, which I'm cracking. I'm just going to read to you a few pieces, and I'll decide whether or not I will stop reading. I'm going to show some brand new images. Also, I'll share my screen. They're so new, and there's something that I've been working on in conversation with this piece now called Virgil Kills, is the official title of the book, then called The Conservation of Mass. I'm just going to share these with you and read. What to say about framing the work is just that I can't stop thinking about Eve. Let me just tell you about Eve Sedgwick and my relationship with Eve's particular course that changed my life, which was called How to Do Things with Words and Other Materials, which was a course that moved around J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. And in the spirit of thinking through the question of performativity and some of the ways in which holding relations were and communities were suspended, held, breached, birthed in that class, she invited us to her studio, graduate students at that time, and sometime, I wanted to say also hi to Nika Perks, who's a colleague at UC Santa Cruz, and I noticed Madison Macarthur is here too, one of the students. I'm just eating an egg and thinking out loud. In this course, she invited this, it was a two-part course. In one half of the course, we were in the classroom at the CUNY Graduate Center, and we were reading works around performativity. We were thinking about queer theory, we were thinking about performance. And then we would go to her studio, which at that time was in Chelsea, and we would make. And in that time, I began working on drawings of Without Sanctuary, James Allen's sort of moving collection of lynching photography. And what I did for that, I think at the time I had won a fellowship at Gerasi. I was finishing up the Graduate Center. I don't know what I was doing. I was in between different places. And I began to draw. So I drew these images, which ended up in the second, or I don't know, Farther Traveler, a collection of poems. And I think that act of drawing was really important. So I'll just read a little bit and show you some new works in relationship to what I've been working on around this question of sort of creative and critical fluidity. I don't know what I call these. I wanted to call them stories. I call them nothing really. And I think that impulse of working to pay attention in the drawing helped me not only to become a better visual artist and to sort of be able to work with a pencil more readily, a pen, but also to look at things that were very uncomfortable and also sort of oddly sexy. You know, one thing indeterminate people, are people dead? Are they alive? So that said, can you see my screen? Yes? Let's see. In the street, Virgil and C stop, where Virgil first stopped on a walk after a day of moving from the collages to the ink and water-soluble oil pastels in the Berlin loft. During that visit, Virgil was in two lofts, the first larger than the second. The second held a window to the street where he set his iPad Pro on the ledge to record others outside for a track. Berlin kids talking on their way to school he caught. This he would set as the background for his slowed down and antique filtered body backstroking in the pool at the Hotel Lafayette in San Diego. The musician For Real, during a recent performance, thought that Virgil was the synchronized swimmer, which is funny as he never was, though in the paused image, Virgil's arms pointed up out of the water projected for the audience before it struck back in to propel him through the pool, serving as a visual backdrop of the performance. Virgil did not think of mimicking the move in the performance. He could easily, as a dancer, no more than he thought about his stroke while swimming. He just felt a need to manipulate the memory, both in film and again on stage. And he wanted to show what he was after, something he understood later, that he was working in gesture to illuminate the line, for sure, but ultimately towards composing the scene with the sculptural. Virgil and C pause in front of a small gallery's exhibit, Prince's Berlin. In the portrait, Virgil sees that the bones of Prince's face are pronounced, even more than Virgil imagined. His skin powdered to white, smooth, yet still angles, shrieks as song as call to the whir of the AC fans. these sounds canceling the birds that he doesn't hear in the morning, in which he wants to remember, because in the red house, the air is cool. At night, the taxi driver does not want Virgil to put his pizza box on the seat. To Virgil, Berlin was so full of starch, rolls after rolls, mornings of flat cheeses and separating eggs and fruits, nuts and toast, as bland as the day, as gray as the streets, few trees, save in a large esplanade, a park where Virgil felt like Narcissus with no pond to reflect in, because the only pond he encountered on his long run was thick with algae. Virgil was going internal in that loft too, and even though his home institution did not forward his grant application to move to the next round, so dumb of them, that round to say that his work had no singular focus, and 3 years later, after Virgil practiced even more, to say his work was now too developed. However, not their type or whatever, Virgil's vision will remain intact and expansive across however many disciplines he wishes to practice or needs to. Discipline for Virgil is compelling. It represents escape into one form or the next, not because he is unsure, but because his wandering is specific. It is not a choice to wander for those displaced, and further still, to those for whom trauma travels, the line is zigzagged. E.g., jagged knife finds the liver, fatty rich and free, toes point to meet the lines, guiding. Virgil's move into the second loft does allow him a different point of view, views into the German homes across the street, the stacked scenes opening up to a morning in which Virgil realizes he has as his process without reservation, a morning chock full of lives, those he does not know, those lives that many lead Virgil to a future worth making his way through and into by layering one performance into another as a means of seeing what might happen over time. For Virgil, the sculptural is a mode of understanding the line, something he finds in the poetry. But for Virgil, fiction and maybe theory isn't about connecting meaning within any one given form. It's about embedding the form in the tempo within the sensation of life, of the news, of the accounts, of the experience, of what it means to alter the sight of what's found, this special counsel, that special counsel. What Virgil escapes from is found in the psychic shapes that the repeating and altering structures of language allow. The patterns of a poem can form a story, so that the sense of what Virgil learns to render is also what he hopes to find in paragraphs. Crotches sometimes come into view, or a dissipating voice in a varied field, the advancement of Virgil's longing. Layered Jabba, who smells of water wash, is obvi jovial. When he describes his time in the wet saunas gone in the new LA Fitness on Long Island because of black mold, because of bacteria, because of expense, the dry sauna men speculate the wet ones had to go, but layered Jabba, who smells of water wash, has another theory to share, one that Virgil knows to be the right one. In every one of them on the island, men were having sex with each other. Is that what they mean by hot, steamy sex? Why would they do that? It could be an invitation, Virgil thinks, to press his towel more into his crotch, the sign then or later, but he concludes the question should be instead, for what other purpose is any men's sauna? Callers calling into Shade 45 announce what they would want on their last day before going off to prison. What a question, but so many tell how they want 3 ways, orgies, but clarify without men. A map to the life of being fully satisfied, but what they want are such, Virgil thinks, lame prescriptions, dumb blacks as dumb whites. In Django Unchained, Hildy, Broomhilda, is trapped in the hotbox for running away, And when the rusted iron lid is ripped open, she lay prone, but is just as quickly roused by the daylight as she is doused with water. In her screams and gasps, Virgil the filmmaker understands the water splashing from the bucket before she is snatched out for service to reveal an impending set of heroics, before Hildy's naked, struggling body is cleaned up to serve. Slaves in medieval collars, shoots corrected to Schultz, the camera trained between the box and the distance, and the tear driving hot down Django's face. For this reason, Virgil feels Django Unchained to be more compelling than Moonlight, because the depicted Black forms in the latter are somehow squarely familiar. Not that Moonlight isn't gorgeous, but it's precisely because of this that allows Virgil to see that he is not deeply taken by the beauty and Blackness as he is in its mixed up amplifications, and how it's violently embedded, its problems beyond time, its impossible correctives. Cinematic tension in any movie for Virgil equals the potential for him to move along the line of his wandering, yes, but wandering in the form of examination and retreat at the same damn time. Hence, for Virgil, his walks are as crucial as his feelings while on the walks. To get lost along a river, to have been traveling along rivers into a hollow that reminds Virgil his path is a series of movements around the subjects, movements away from a history of what he might record for then, for now, for them. Why? I think that's it. All that I have to share.
Thank you so much, Ronaldo. And thank you to all three of you. Yeah, let's unclap one more time and give a round of applause, make some noise for Ronaldo, Andrea, and Simon. So we're going to move into the Q&A section now. If you have a question, feel free to unmute. If you'd rather put it in the chat box, that's also fine. As a way of sort of opening this up, I thought I'd maybe talk about some things that came up for me while you all were talking. And something stood out to me in Simon's, where you were talking about how to be faithful with the experience of an errant reading. And then Andrea, you also brought up how we read, or how to read with poetry. And I was thinking about this in relation to Ronaldo's specific wandering. So I'm not sure if there's really even a question in there, except for maybe to open that up for you to kind of engage with and with each other.
Well, I can, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, errancy as wandering certainly was part of what I was talking about, but also, you know, linked to that, the idea of errancy as something which would be thought to be in error for various reasons, and it can be a moral error or an ethical error, or an error of allowing yourself a scandalous thought, or something which is in some way shaming or furtive or best left unspoken. And how, you know, any kind of experience, let alone literary experience or artistic experience, is full of them. You know, it's but those stories very, very rarely enter the story of criticism, because it's implicitly self-correcting, self-revising, and kind of harmonizing to a kind of agreed story. And so it becomes, you know, and that links, I think, to one of the things I dislike about a lot of criticism, which I mean, I no doubt I share in this in my own work, which is the pretense, the presumption of authority, where you kind of elide the mess, or the plumbing. It's like a palace or something, you know, and underneath is all the crap, all the shit, all the plumbing, all the moss, all the rats, and you just see this kind of room with a carpet and a mirror. You know, and I just don't think that's good enough. So I think one of the things I like about the fictiveness, I mean, that's not, I think it's in a way it was easier with the Macbeth book with Ewan to allow whatever thought we wanted, however insane or inadmissible in polite society, because it could be characterized, it could be given to a voice, a different voice. And also the fact, as I said before, the sort of the shared voice gives you freedom. It gives you a kind of irony, if you like. But I think in a way it's equally important in to find ways in a more confessed critical act to allow those things and to frame them or not. I think that's quite important, and that's more difficult in a way, and a more courageous thing to do, because it exposes you. But I think it's something we need to do.
Yeah, I think Emma, when I first hear the word errancy, and I love that connection you made between the different pieces and the different the errant, the reading and wandering, and I'm thinking through glissant here. When I hear errant, I think of glissant poetics of relation as this move against the mono, against the monolingual, the mono anything, which Simon, like the authority, or the one who takes the space to make authority. So errancy perhaps gives a way to think in a more multiple way, or from multiple spaces. For me, you mentioned reading, definitely about reading with rather than about a text, to the best of my abilities. Like, what does it mean to read with something instead of making a pronouncement about it? So there is a bit of errancy with that, to let it just go and kind of build or let it do what it's going to do. And then Ronaldo, I loved your piece so much. The wandering, the dancer, swimmer, guide, Virgil, moving through all these places. And when I think of that wandering, I think always of just your practice as a whole, with these expansive ways of like expansive textual engagement. Yeah, so I love that connection, Emma, that you made, with that sense of movement.
Yeah, I might be muted. I don't really know. No, I'm not. So I agree with everything. I wanted to put two sort of objects on the table or in the room, which is the institution and the body, which I think has in our cases perhaps as a group, but I'm also thinking of the folks in the room who are and aren't here. Eve Sedgwick among, also Mina Alexander. I think two writers who were engaged in both having to pose with the kind of authoritative assuredness and assured stance as professors and workers, but also always, I think, in both the writing and in their practices, had a relationship to tethering at the ends of the institution through, the imagination, perhaps placing the foreground in the imagination in as a kind of, to use Eve's words, as a kind of point of sale. And I remember, thinking about Mina Alexander as one of my teachers, and her saying, you've paid your dues now. I don't know which book it was, but you've paid your dues. She's always giving me these markers. When you're 50, all of your, at 50, you should have finished all of your major works or something like this. She would always give me these time. At 30, what are you still doing in your dissertation? At 40, what are you doing? Finish. But I think it was to make space for the errancy, to make space for the the epiphanies of adolescence, to keep going back to Simon's language, or your notion through Eve of this kind of holding of relations, and I think that toggling between the shit that's the life, right? I mean, it takes a lot of crazy work to be working as a dancer and as a painter and as a professor and as an artist. Like, I have to be very particular because my back will 2 or 3 days ago I couldn't walk, right? And so I have to be really aware of, I keep checking in with myself. And for those of you who know, in terms of scholars of color, queer scholars, it's just like bodies give out. We don't last. And I think we do last, but I'm interested in lasting. So I just wanted to put that in, that there is a different relationship that I think we have as bodies who are, sort of, implicated in the shit as the fodder, you know, this constant sense of being invisible, not being good. So that kind of working against that and in it and whatever that means, I think has been really difficult. As you know, and I think that for me, why I'm pressed to move in other directions. Too many consequences, right? Not receiving a single grant at the highest level of my institution. Only after 12 or I don't know how many years I've been at an institution of finally having one grant moved to an external reviewer. Constantly told that I don't have a research question. This is the same question that I've been told since I was working millions of years ago at UC Berkeley as a student of June Jordan and Barbara Christian. I didn't have a research question. Now I often am accused of not having a research question pretty much every single moment. So what do, right? And what do we do as scholars who are rendered invisible and also told that you don't belong, you're erased, and how do you begin to make work? So, I mean, I just move outside of language itself. Like, I don't care. I'll just, you know, take pics of my iPhone, animate that shit up, put a soundtrack on it, give me the next raise. I'm ready, because it'll count in my file. Stop it already. Because I'm just going to get paid no matter what, you know? So I'm interested in that, sort of the question too that Simon opened with too, is this idea of the kind of visibility. I don't know how you said it, Simon, like you said something super fancy about being, you know, adhered to the university or post or something, that kind of, you know, I think it's important to have that. So anyway, I'm just rambling around that, but I think it's important to think about the relationship between the lived body and the sort of abused body and the functional body and the imagining body in these institutions, and what language is in it.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't have any of the history of dancing and so forth, but it's kind. It seems to be really quite important to for me to develop relationships outside the university, outside the academy, with different people. Not everyone's a bloody scholar, you know, and to working with artists and actors and practitioners of various kinds has been sort of life affirming for me over the last 5 or 8 years. Yeah.
We're in the K-hole of silence.
I'd love to ask a question if that's all right. Simon, thanks so much. I loved what you said about the Fairy Queen and thinking about it as a figure of kind of slightly pointless criticism and people wandering around and not recognizing each other. I think that's very appealing. And you said about the form of the poem telling true, even if the poet and his task are not up for it. You spoke about it as an ecosystem. But I think my question is, at a time when I guess we are kind of very post-structuralism, what do you do with the author? Kind of thinking about the ecology of the poem, kind of working on its own, but then also thinking, you know, we've been talking about the body of the writer being visible or invisible, as Ronaldo was just saying. So I was wondering if you could say something about that. Thank you.
What I do with the author. It's a really good question. I mean, there's lots of answers to that. I mean, I think one, it depends. I mean, sort of hypothetically annihilate the author is one way of doing it, and to say that, I mean, one of the things I learned was it's an ongoing process, was working with the Australian Indigenous people who have a completely different concept of storytelling and of land and story being absolutely co-creative, embedded in one another. And I came, that sort of encouraged me in something I'd already had an inkling of, which was to see the poem as a land, almost literally as land. in which the poet comes with his different forms of fencing and building, the stanzas and so forth, and in a sense that the land speaks, notwithstanding the fencing. There's all sorts of stuff that exists, you know, and I think that's true. I think that so in certain ways, I think it's important to recover the material from the poet, even as he is extraordinarily control, you know, in all sorts of ways, an amazingly creative shaper of the work. That's one answer. Another response I find myself dealing with is to kind of invent. I mean, there's all the stuff about Spencer, the colonialist, the sort of servant of the genocidal regime, the writer of, you know, literally genocidal pamphlets and so forth, and that's oddly difficult. As soon as you begin to take it seriously, rather than as a kind of historical curiosity or a kind of complicitous scandal, it becomes really difficult actually to think about that, and to think about the generation of so much that's still being engaged with and taken seriously, and then to think about the productive, maybe symbiotic relationship between forms of violence and forms of beauty and so forth. I think that's a way of doing it, and then to think about the ways in which I think there's too much. I think it's too easy to assume a superior position to the author, particularly one like Spencer. It's too easy to, as it were, notionally wash our hands and say that we're free of these kinds of things, and just because we sign up to the right things or vote for this party or whatever. I don't think, and I think one of the things when I was talking about minor key stuff, or you know, the adolescent epiphanies and so forth, are all the different ways in which one's own sort of trivial life might in its own way kind of adumbrate these an atrocity, just an act of denial, an act of shame or something, an act of refusal, you know, whatever. So I think that's a way in which there can be a sort of both a distance and a recognition between oneself and an author. Yeah. And then finally, what I'd say is that in the sort of intense, slightly magnifying readings of the poem I've been doing, I have to say, I have recovered a real sense that this guy was an amazing poet. You know, I have to say that the craft and the skill and the intelligence is just something to behold. It really, really is. And I think he's far, far, far better than his own self-advertising. That's what I would say. But yeah, different strategies.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat about how you each relate to the term auto theory.
Hi, Mika. Auto theory is great. I think, you know, I appreciate people who are identifying their work under that name. I don't necessarily, if a part of it's a question about how I relate to that for my own work, I don't necessarily think of myself as doing auto theory, and that my head is still wrapping around the responses from both Simon and Ronaldo, but thinking about that the body, the self, is always in the writing. It's about how it recedes or how it comes forward. And I also think again of bell hooks and theory as liberatory practice, that theorists have always been theorizing from their position, their subject position, their place. So I think auto theory might be doing in that lineage. Yeah, but self, body, thinking have always been in the text. It just depends on how it's, if it leads with self, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of it in ways in which I didn't know. At some point, someone, I think it was Wayne Kestevan, said, "Oh, you know, who are you reading? You must be allied with experimental writing." I was like, I don't know, what are you talking about? Experimental writers, experimental. And I'm finding in some ways that our writing might sort of move into the realm of auto theory, that the work itself is, I mean, I think about I.D.B. Wells as a red record. Is that auto theory? You know, or or think about, the Prelude, Wordsworth's Prelude, which I read, first encountered fully in a context of Romanticism and Empire in a class with Mina Alexander, reading that next to Stedman Suriname. So I think these moments in which we prescribe, I think, terms it's territory, right? I mean, just to put the sort of elephant in the room, auto theory is a way in which theorists or people can then, an institution can control or map out a supersign in which we may hover for cover, right? Or not. But I think that it could be useful in terms of ways in which it, as a scholar of literature, I think, who's interested in things like periodicity or formal engagements and, brackets around both period, aesthetic sensibility, time, even race, or it's helpful, right? But I think that I often, think, across maybe what we're all talking about is that the relationship between the author and the embodied being is always precarious. I think what I find to be really interesting are moments in which sort of compromised bodies and beings, I don't know if this is probably going to get me into some form of trouble, is that the presence of compromised beings in the academy often usher in a theory to hold it. I remember Barbara Christian years ago at Berkeley, talking about Henry Louis Gates, and she was then, she and June and all these folks who were teachers were talking about In Search of Her Mother's Gardens, Alice Walker, and thinking about, and Barbara Christian would not allow any of her graduate students to read any theory, right? And her thesis was like, and here comes Skip Gates coming from, that's that critical race for theory is such an important article. And I think there is something about, well, we have a choice as practitioners who work to not even write. I love that moment of silence that happens, that kind of, well, like, why do we have to race towards these kind of fields? I feel like it's, it's like, whatever. It's like, people like Kenny G. I'm good with Kenny G. I can get down with Kenny G. That's fine. I like I like underground rap. I like all kinds of styles, but I think part of it is first of all, not a sexy term, auto theory, nor Afro-pessimism, not sexy, not hot, not happening in my mind. This is not aesthetically and sonically not rich. Eggs are, eggs, I'm eggy, I call it Afro, peso-moistism is what I was working on, I have an entire book of just made up languages, and, or I don't think that we have to choose to configure our relationship if we have a job. I think this is the thing that I keep going back to, because I got money and I have some form of status. I can make certain decisions that I couldn't make 10 years ago, or maybe I made them in a different way, but I choose my spots really carefully. And I think auto theory is something that I'm attentive to and super interested in, but it doesn't get me all hot and bothered. Lyric essay does this rubric, right? Like creative theory, that's interesting to me. That's hot. That has a certain kind of, the questions that are formed here. I remember when Emma, I thought, oh, this is, of course, there's something in the way in which you're thinking about writing that's, anyway, there's something that I'm trying to work through it. And, oddly enough, I'm editing a book, a special call for Black writers around some of these questions, or others who are interested in, theory is an interesting word, right? But auto theory, come on, as a poet, if I'm writing a poem and the word auto theory comes up, I'm not even sure where that's going to belong, unless I have to get rid of the A or something. Uto theory, uto, ut. I can't. I get rid of the A and I'm down. Uto theory, I get it. Makes more sense to me. Slam it together in one word. Much nicer too. The O's open up. Ototheo. Let's just get rid of the R and the Y too. Let's call it Ototheo. That's much more interesting to me. Ototheo. Break it.
Looks like Jen Scapatone has a raised hand. That's for a question. question, Jen, or is that just in solidarity?
I love this autote. We made it today. We made up our own autote.
And I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, I would love to hear more about that class with Eve Sedgwick. If you're willing to talk about it, because it seems like that may have been an accidental anecdote, but it really resonates with what you're saying now about just turning away from language. And I just would love to hear more about that pedagogical push to get you into the studio and outside of language, because it seems really formative, and I really hear what you're saying right now.
I will just say that, that course was part of a series of courses that she taught. I guess I was at the CUNY Graduate Center in sort of around the 2000s or so, 99, 2000 or something like that. That course was, essentially what it was just the fascinating thing. It was just divided between studio time and theory time. But I think that class was on the heels of several other classes, which I think are important to think through. One was one of the first courses that she taught at the CUNY Graduate Center was called Victorian Textures. And she asked everyone to read the whole of whatever canon, Ruskin, I forget, we're reading all sort of the major Victorian writers, but we were only looking at questions of texture. So I made these weird rubbings of statues and men's chest hairs, and people were working in these tactile ways. And it was interdisciplinary because people from the CUNY Graduate Center were there, Columbia Performance Studies. So some of Jose Munoz's students were in the room. So all of us were at this critical nexus at that time in New York. And also, and another course that she taught was a couple of them around queer performativity. Wayne Kestenbaum was also teaching courses. Let me tell you, he was teaching courses where I think much of the discussions around auto theory were coming out of the courses. I think it was called lyric fiction or something? I forget what, lyric imagination. I think he was working through. So there was this nexus of classes at that time where we were thinking with other folks. And Eve was really particularly interesting because she stopped at that time. She was making sculpture, soft sculpture, and writing more poetry near the end of her life, and also teaching Buddhist texts. So she made this radical, so as someone to come into a program thinking, oh, I'm gonna work with this hardcore theorist, the first thing that she did in Victorian Textures was to pass around spun silk. And just to ask us to talk about spun silk with one another. And I think for me, it was formative, and I keep coming back to the possibility, had I not encountered, and I actually came to the CUNY Graduate Center to work with Bell Hooks, who left the program at that time. And suddenly I was working with Wayne Kestenbaum. So I had to kind of throw Wayne Kestenbaum and Eve Sedgwick. So I had to kind of throw my Black ascending scholarly, and Michelle was there, Michelle Wallace, I worked with her. But I think formatively, it was really important that I was placed in the context of a studio, and that studio practice, it got me into a lot of, I think it moved my work, but it also still, I think, has left me out of some primary conversations. I think I will say that, but I think I don't have a language a lot of the time, but I have a practice. And I think that's what her course helped to do, was to try to say, if you're looking at this theory, how does one develop a practice? I hope that helps. I'm just, that's a little bit of it.
No, that's pretty amazing as a history, I think.
I'm glad you said, thank you, because it's very moving to even think through, to go back to Eve's work again,
She also has a piece that's in some kind of creative criticism anthology, but called Teaching Creative Criticism or something like this. I've been looking for it, I can't remember, but I think the two things that keep coming up for me really with all of your work are performativity and pedagogy. So maybe we could stay on that a little bit longer, but also thinking of manifesto as like making manifest or making public, and the role that pedagogy might have in that. And I'm not thinking here of like the institutional limitations that we have, but more as like the act of teaching.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I love the invitation to think of that outside the limits of institution. And but I think that might be for me. I experience myself as sort of quasi-institutional. I mean, not in a secure academic position, teaching in all different sites, teaching everyone from teenagers, high schoolers to graduate students. So there's this range and all different sites, the college, also community centers. But with that comes that question of money and support and things like that. So I think I appreciate what Ronaldo said, the press to move in different directions when thinking about decisions one makes about one's work. And so there's the expansive part of, okay, I write this way, I do these things. And then there's the other part of choosing not to knock at the door constantly. So that both of those are active in my practice, even if the other doesn't come through as much. Sometimes my placement in terms of institutions. But thinking of pedagogy, I love the invitation to think about pedagogy, about learning and teaching together, learning/teaching, learners, teachers together in a space, and building and transforming. And I think that I'd probably bring in our particular moment right now too, that many people are doing that work around, that there seems to be a pressure on the institution to rethink how we learn together. So I don't know. That was an errant answer to your question.
Yeah, I'm not even sure I had a question. Thanks.
I'm just inspired to think of Spencer, Eve, Renee, us, and to think about I guess maybe the sort of accidental lineages that are inherent, and also the kind of ways in which the impulse to learn. I think for me, the classroom is, I mean, I like stress, I like pressure, I don't mind it. But I know that sort of moment of debilitation, or not sure what you're going to say at the lecture table or in the classroom, might be better served in thinking about, what are how can we move backwards, and also how can we touch our toes or move under the table or bring something raw into the room, because that feeling, or the sweating body, or the sort of confused, I think the confused self is actually the kind of formative ether that creates the kind of ether that perhaps makes up the space for these counter lineages to happen, these alternative lineages, the nervousness, right? I mean, I've been making my courses recently. I taught a course on rage. I'm teaching another course I'm calling it ha ha, because there's frankly not enough laughter in the academy. So bored by every single talk that I'm bored out of my mind, and I'm bored because you're making it so boring, because you're not even managing any form of animation or smile. Like, what is that weird monotone, I just think, well, what about humor? Stand-up comedy, or just ways to get into or to open up the discourse, laughter. I mean, I haven't really laughed today, really. I'm laughing inside my heart, but I think that there's something around tone, just getting back to these basics in teaching that for me are really interesting, and so much of it is, Andrea, around a fit, right? I mean, maybe it's good, I think, to have this protracted movement so that you find the exact place that you want to be to make the living that you need to make without suffering at some weird, I'll give everything up and fake it like I'm some weird African Americanist or some weird person so I can go to this weird school and get jacked up for like 1,000 years. you're making the right decisions by teaching and moving in a kind of tentacular fashion, right? Like, what is that decision, and how do you sort of understand that as the mode that's giving us the richness and the joy of conversation, and that in the ether of that sort of, that truly is the subaltern, that truly is the undercommons. Like, but so often in theory, the undercommons or the subaltern gets performed as some like above board theoretical aesthetic. Hello, it's often the case that I'm chased by whomever because I don't belong or whatever. Or I'm told I stink. Or did you happen in the pool the other day? Like, did you shower? What do you mean, did I shower? What are you talking about? How are you talking? Did I shower before? I can't even swim without. People bother me all the time. That's funny to me and important. So I'm really interested in this kind of unfurling of where the pedagogical sort of explosion begins in the discomfort.
There's another question in the chat about lineages, which I was also thinking about as you were talking about counter lineages, but Pamela says, can you please speak more about lineages? I loved Sharon Bridgeforth naming lineages, and from today's speaker, I'm thinking about back to how academic discourse rewards me for citing my references and lineages, but there's a challenge in bringing that mode to my Pina Yorker poetics. To be honest, there's a sense of alienating somebody by choosing when I just want to mix it up multidisciplinary. I think there's also something about the idea of like lineage that is almost counter to experimental criticism, or in establishing a sort of genealogy or canon. It's kind of counter to what is trying to be done, maybe.
It's Pinay Yorker, but thank you so much for trying. It's Pinay Yorker. Thank you. But yes, I appreciate that too, where it's like there's me looking to other formal experiments like Zuihitsu. I love the academic Zuihitsu. I love these like other ways to experiment, but I just really like bringing it back to what you just said, Ronaldo, about lineages, because that still feels like a very like community focused framework. I only really hear that most with BIPOC circles, but especially like cutie poc.
Yeah, I mean, your language is actually fresher than lineage to me. Like the Pina Yorker poetics, mix-ups, mixtapes, sort of multi-poetic formations. I think we have to seek, I talk to my graduate students about constellative formations. I don't even think about lineages so much, because once we think about lineages, then we have to start thinking about periodicity, the line, yes, and also the footnote, right? Like, throw them in the footnote, throw all the people in the footnote, all the people that in your language that you are, all the sort of alienating people, put them in the footnote. There's a space in the lineage for the footnote. It's a tradition. It's like, how do you elevate, whomever you're thinking through, and relegate the master canon folks into the footnote, one sentence, done. You know what I mean? Or play. I think that they're the form of the essay and the form of a scholarly discourse. That's why frankly, that's why there are very few people of color in the academy, because we know how to play around with form, master improvisers. What do we do with an essay? Hello, Renee Gladman's body of work. I think that's, and what happened to Renee, right? I mean, Renee's lineage, right? Renee, that's a whole other discussion. But I think it's really important to play around, especially if you are in the position of receiving these forms, the essay, the lineage, the genealogy, is to say, well, what are other ways to kind of play around? The risk is exclusion, but exclusion may mean something like it gets you to, Pina poetics, Pina Yorker poetics. That's interesting to me. That's sexy. That's revealing. That's curious. That's learned. Is that part of the New York school?
Ninochka Roska, the OG.
Oh, see, that's what I said. There's a whole lineage of like Pina, New York. Am I a part of that lineage? I'm a New York person, right? I mean, so how do we kind of configure those terms so that lineage becomes a use value for articulating our passion.
Well, the exclusion to the point of legibility comes up more now that I think about it, about I've not cared about making certain things legible, but I have a lot more sources. I just feel like I'm just learning a lot. All of these references everyone was doing today was just amazing, and it was really just feeding each other. That's what I liked. And I know that one part of it is I don't want everything to be well, I'm not only going to talk about Pinay Yorker-ness. I'm very educated by Black women writers. So frankly, that's something I'm very close to. So
I guess that's the intervention I'm interested in. As a theorist, I'm why don't we put the Black people under Pinay Yorker as a moniker? It's so racist that we have these departments that are I think that that's the fluidity I'm interested in. Again, we'll get you into trouble. But part of it is, how do you build a frame that allows African-American women? And if you look at, I'm sorry to be going on, but if you look at the sort of as you probably know, I'm sure you know, the cultural movements of the 80s, the sort of community building in the 80s, those were sort of not only transgressive, but definitely trans-race, transgender, trans-feminist histories. So they were, Jessica Hagedorn, for instance, Jessica's relationship to, Audre Lorde or any of those figures. I'm just thinking that why not put African-American women under Pinay Yorker aesthetics in the same ways white theory houses anyone they want under the New York school at will.
This bridge called My Back, my friend just pointed out, Teresa Hak-Kyung Cha,
right.
4th edition. There's a picture of her art, and I went, oh no, I don't have that edition, but there it is right here in This Bridge Called My Back.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to say about that. Part of it is what happens when you start doing the kind of scholarly research in which you're archiving, I don't know the term, but you begin to archive the history of that book as manifesto, and look for those papers, whose papers survive. All that stuff sort of creates these sort of sexy conditions for folks who are not represented to go into these archives and to do exactly what you've just done now, to sort of arrest the photograph that's not seen or not captured. This is exciting to me.
I would just quickly add to that, thinking about lineages, I think of a line to a point where I'm supposed to be located. And that it's this tracing that's showing an expertise in a field. So thinking about counter archives, I love the invitation. I'm thinking about it as a constellation. And I know one thing that's exciting to me is when I read someone who's bringing their own interest from all different types of disciplines or fields together, and that's the body mind giving the analysis or the piece of writing, and how exciting that is. And so writers who are bringing from, I think Gabrielle Seville just said goodbye, but from Black feminist thought, performance studies, visual art, literary theory, and working from all these different fields and bringing that to a single essay. How exciting is that? And hearing from different archives that are being activated in this way. So I think of something as different between a line seems steady. It goes back to the mono for me. It can go back to the mono. I don't want to be absolutist about it, but that something else happens when I'm thinking about Sedgwick, and that helps me think about Gladman. And now Gladman, I'm looking at Lynn Hegenian's Positions of the Sun. So I'm moving around and thinking about different a question through different texts.
Yeah, I think we can, I was thinking about first looking at Ronaldo's memojis. Is that how you pronounce that? I think so. Memoji? I don't know. I should ask my 10-year-old. As little homunculi or something. And I started to think about critical work as a kind of homunculus of the text that it's approaching, or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe, you know, the text itself is a homunculus as the author, going back to that question about the author. And I think Simon was sort of working around what to do with the author, where is, which author is where in the text. And so this kind of, all these little memojis wandering around in the critical text, in the creative text. And maybe that has something to do with this question of lineage too. You know, it becomes the text, a critical text becomes a community, distalized in some way. Maybe you guys could speak to how all of this makes it into the text itself, because we're talking about community in this broader sense, lineage, pedagogy, being actually in person, but somehow it all goes back into the text, into the piece of writing, or into the reading of the writing. We're back on the page. Maybe you could speak to that, and then we'll wrap it up. Maybe Emma can wrap it up at the.
But I think a lot. I think there's a lot of desperate forms of sort of mimetic desire going on in footnoting and so on. And I think there's an extraordinarily timidity and follow the leader, and a desperate need for, you know, you've got to reference the necessary things and pretend you've read them and all of that stuff. And I find it very, very tiring. And I think it's a pseudo community. It's not a real community, but it's a community which allows you to remain in, as it were, in the building, or, you know, I don't think that's nourishing. And I think what Andrea said about a piece of work that genuinely acknowledges the work that is swirling around your brain while you're working, that the stuff that is genuinely informing your thinking and being allowed to bring whatever in. I think that's much more interesting. I mean, I don't think that necessarily answers the question. I mean, I think that I've been personally attracted to so-called scholarly projects that have almost kind of obviated the need for footnotes. And so, for example, a big book I did a few years ago, which went to the original text of Shakespeare, you know, the not the play, but the part text which precedes the play, and imagining that, imagining we're looking at them for the first time along with the actors, which meant there's no critical history, there's no performance history, and so there's no need to look at anything. It was fantastic. And so I didn't read a single critical book the whole time I wrote this book, not one, you know. And you know, that was completely liberating, because you're on your own, and you can, and it's a different form of lineage, it's a different form of inheritance, it's a different form of well, sympathy, I suppose, in the fuller sense of the word, going on, a kind of sympathy with a particular condition, with a particular information technology, if you like, which was this part text, blah blah blah, you know. And that you know, that has generated lots of footnotes that work, you know, but it didn't rely upon that. And I think there's an enormous amount. I think one of the big problems with scholarly writing that I know of is that the insecurity that comes, the idea that you can't risk a statement unless you can have a footnote which authorizes it. You know, you tell your students, don't argue from authority, but the scholars are always doing that. They're always seeking the authority for what they want to say, you know, and they allow themselves one idea a chapter or something, you know. Anyways, that's just a bit gripey because it's getting late.
No, yeah, I feel you in terms of like the relationship between with the, you know, with the author also comes, you know, authorial verve and the authorial presence. And I think there's something very particular around what happens when you don't have the footnote and you are, you know, someone who doesn't know any of the forms, that has to master the footnote to write a simple essay, or they won't pass the class, or they won't, or a scholar who, if you don't say that right thing, you'll be seen as completely so dumb and so black or so brown or so queer that every advantage that you actually have to have the footnotes. I mean, that's the difficulty, right? I mean, the difficulty is having to play the notes and also having to be able to improvise. And I think there's something around what we're getting at is yes, and, right? Yes, I do think that if one can sort of understand the sort of form of the essay as an adventure, as you call it, And how do we teach that to students of all kind of social ilks, right? And social categories. But I do think there's the pressing, you know, I know that if I'm performing, you know, I think of it like I received a PhD and I worked at scholarship. It's my choice to give back to the institution what I've learned, or to go to sleep and dream about it and to not kill someone, or to sleep deeply. There are subconscious ways in which I don't have to give this information up, but I do have to give it up in order to make my rent payment, or there are certain conventions. And I think that that's the difficulty I think that I've been noticing probably all of my life in terms of thinking about what, you know, what scholarship can provide, who gets to have the freedom, you know, at what point do you master a certain, you know, formal mode so that you can then play, you know, should you just start playing? I think those are sort of epistemological and pedagogical questions I think about. But I think there is something around what's at the relationship next to the author is real freedom and leisure. You know, I know that I think that it's very important to say that many people who do master the forms, you know, their bodies give out, right? I mean, none of my major primary advisors are lived, and most of them died of cancer. And I think that had to do with playing with these forms and not figuring out how to toggle with it. And I might live a little bit longer because I'm a little bit more playful. But I do think it's important to at least have some relationship to the formal practice of footnoting or whatever it is, so that you can play with it, maybe, or maybe not having it is important. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to think of not necessarily understanding what it means to be a target or a pro or all those things. So that it's complicated for me.
Yeah.
Well, unless anyone has any last thoughts or questions, we might leave it at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean, yeah, this is fun. I mean, I don't know.
It's been great.
Thank you.
I guess it was great. Yeah, thank you.
There is a video of last week's panel on our website on the events tab, which I'll put in the chat right now. The recording of this event will be up there this week. Also, we forgot to mention, but the panelist pieces that are in Manifold are also on our website for the next week. So if you'd like to read them, they are there. And next week's event is on subjective criticism, co-hosted with Spam Press, and it will feature Julie Carr, Colin Dan, Jim Miranda, and Ali Graham.
Can I just say this is the first time I've ever been in any of these conversations where I feel like I'm vibrating. Like I felt really, really, there's something around the thinking here. I feel excited. I feel energized by it. So I just wanted to, there's something I haven't felt before in my body. So I just wanted to say.
It might be the lack of the egg.
Fury, Ronaldo. There's what's happening in my body.
What's that? What's happening in your body?
He just made me a little teary.
Oh.
It might be the lack of the egg, but you know, sometimes we don't get everything we want.
Simon,
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted you.
Sorry?
I interrupted you, Simon. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say what the egg gives you all you need, and Guinness gives you all you want. That's the old Irish saying. So I might go off and have a beer. It's evening here in, you know, Virusville.
Yeah, it must be getting pretty late over there.
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock nearly. So yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed this, and I look forward to the next one.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.